In a huge ominous mansion, a girl was running excitedly, and it seems that the reason for her running, it's a matter of life and death. She frightenedly kicked her heels on the tile of the mansion. Afterward, she called sharply to the young gentleman and bursting into the room opened the doors. She excitedly looked at him and tried to understand what had happened to him. In the end, to the disappointment of the protagonist, there was suddenly a notice that the girl still failed to protect the target. The text read, Diane Redford has passed away and the cause of his death was achalasia poison and profuse bleeding. The protagonist watched a beautiful young boy who would never wake up again, and then she saw a sign that informed her that the game was over. The girl clenched her fist angrily in frustration and disappointment. She seemed to be furious about what had happened. She tearfully cursed the moonfish, which was what the girl called the dead guy. Moonfish was the name given to bad swimmers who were unable to overcome the strong current. Outside the 21st century, the exact year is unknown. Virtual reality games have rapidly burst into the fashion of this time. And what the protagonist is playing is one of the most popular games among girls lately. Her name is Young Masters of the Monster Mansion, Raising an Angel. In this game, you have to choose one of the angel-like boys who live in the cursed mansion. The player's task is to protect the chosen hero from evil spirits and monsters that live in this mansion and also try to make the chosen pupil an outstanding man. Incredible detail and thoughtfulness of the game clearly prove that the creators have worked on the glory as the game had simply excellent detail, both the premise and antagonists. Players also had the opportunity to choose a field of activity. The game also had more than 30 types. The player could choose to become a servant, a teacher, a priestess, or a hunter, even a distant relative, and many other things. Although the protagonist has never been a fan of such games but could not resist. At the beginning of the game, she chose the role of a maid working in a mansion, and among the 7 young hosts she chose Diane Redford, a handsome young man with silver hair, but this young gentleman, despite his mesmerizing looks and pleasant personality, was too much like a moonfish. The girl immediately realized that to play and protect this character will be insanely hard, but the choice still fell on him, as the appearance and character he liked the main character more than the other young gentlemen of the mansion. The girl thought about the fact that she should have immediately guessed why the protection of this character was called an impassable level, but the girl still didn't give up. After the first 10 ridiculous deaths, the girl promised herself each time that on her next try, she would definitely finish the game and help the hero live to his 16th birthday. But for the last time, she nurtured and protected the character, and he managed to grow up to be a big enough guy that the protagonist had to end the game soon. But Diane died suddenly when the girl left him for a short time, even though she had asked him many times to stay on her bed, and the girl still did not understand why he left the room and went outside, and then crossed the river Yoden. The girl stood in the room where the lifeless body of her ward now rested and looked up and watched death bending over her, gloating that she had finally been able to take his soul for herself. And then, as if mocking, the girl said that she undoubtedly felt very unhappy, as she was once again alone in the world. And after scrutinizing her with his violet eyes, he offered a perfect solution to her problem. He could kill her and then she wouldn't be lonely anymore. But the girl was offended, such behavior on the part of the evil spirit, and so yelled at him and threatened that he did not even think of mocking her again. When the protagonist chased away the evil spirit, a game tablet appeared in front of her with the choice of whether she wanted to keep the video recording from episode 214. When the girl chose the answer, she thought that maybe it's time for her to quit this game for a long time, and after turning to the company of developers said that they are just scoundrels because it's generally illegal that she can't pass this game for several years in a row. Watching her ward carefully, she addressed him and said that she would not play anymore, but he remained absolutely immovable. Then the girl did not give up and with a disgruntled face said that he should come to his senses, because this time she and the truth will leave all attempts and just finish the game. But the guy of incredible appearance lay there and gave no sign of life. After the girl bent down and began to look at his face, the protagonist realized that no matter how she threatened, she could not really leave him at all. And then she stroked his cheek and warned him that next time she'd be sure to keep him alive. She wondered if she didn't care how many times she tried, but the guy absolutely had to survive. She admitted to herself that she'd tried other games, but she'd gotten too attached to this one because of Diane, among other things. But suddenly a mysterious voice addressed her, saying that if the girl really intended to save him, he was entrusting this important task to her. She was shocked, her body bound by fear like thorny vines, and she couldn't move. Her eyes opened wide and her pupils narrowed with fright. But trying to analyze what had happened, she assumed that perhaps this unknown voice was some kind of error in the game's system. Suddenly, everything was flooded with bright white light, and when the girl next opened her eyes, she found that she was in a familiar room of the mansion. She was approached by a maid who asked Mistress Rin to come to the room. Ta wondered, not understanding. She wondered if it was because of this bug in the game system that she had been sent back to the first episode. But the maid didn't let her ponder and turned to the young master and warned him that a new teacher had come to see him, but the boy only asked her why she had come so late. The girl was still brooding, looking at what was happening, not understanding how she could become a teacher, since in the last game she had always been a maid and didn't choose a new position. But then the doors swung open, and the protagonist saw standing in front of the window a young gentleman whose hair fluttered beautifully in the wind. He turned to his new teacher and asked her unhappily, how could she be as much as 5 minutes late for their class? He also added that she had done it on the first day of school, which made the situation even worse. And then he asked if the girl did not intend to do her job well. The girl put her hand to her heart and realized that although she was seeing this scene for the 44th time, but she was reveling in seeing Diane as if it was the first time, so her heart began to beat out a rapid rhythm. The maid bowed to the gentleman and apologized and also informed him that it was her fault that they were late, as they were a bit delayed on their way to the mansion. After the maid pointed to a young gentleman and introduced him to the girl, she told him that he was the young gentleman she would be taking care of from today. The boy asked the maid why she addressed her simply as Mrs. Rin. He asked her for the girl's last name. The maid was about to pronounce, but then the heroine introduced herself on her own and said her name was Logoth Rin. She realized that the boy was very cute, but she doesn't like mistakes in games, so she decided to introduce herself on her own. Then young Mr. Diane, repeating her name and surname, said that her manner of speech seemed different from that of the locals and inquired, had the girl come to him from the north? But the girl thought only of the fact that for some reason she had pronounced the wrong surname and that she could not get out of the game. But at that moment, the main character had an epiphany. She began to recall that she had apparently gotten into one of the first scenes of this game, and then wondered what should happen in the next moment. Then she shrieked, stopping the vase flying at the young gentleman, and ordered him to duck as quickly as possible. The vase shattered over the girl's head, but she was able to shield Mr. Diane with her body. That's when the girl remembered that the first scene should begin with the reincarnation of the handmaid into a monster. The boy, sitting on the cold floor of his room, watched his maid and didn't understand how he should behave. His face was contorted with animal fear, and he stammered and asked Rin what was happening to his maid. The boy was still trying to bring himself to his senses and turning to the main character fearfully asked if the maid had become Amora, so the girl turned around then, not answering his question, not taking the time to explain and looking around the area looking for something she could defend herself with. Rin noticed 2 cross-hanging daggers on the wall. She immediately realized that it looked like she was going to have to use those swords to clear her path this time. But there was one more thing she had to do before that. Ripping off a white thick sheet of good fabric, she gently covered the boy's head as she didn't want her baby boy to see what would be happening in the room soon. At this moment, the maid, having finished her final transformation and finally coming to her senses, angrily cackled and began to approach the protagonist to attack. The girl quickly oriented herself and reached for her sword with her hand, but fell a little short, so she took a decisive leap in flight and snatched the sword from the wall. After that, she made a maneuver and ended up above the monster's head. After that, one sharp movement easily cut off its head. After dealing with the monster, the protagonist thought that this scene was already insanely easy for her, since she had passed it 43 times, unlike the NPC who attacked her. But after the girl shockingly looked around at herself and everything around her, and noticed that for some unknown reason, the blood on her face and clothes did not disappear, she recalled that the scene in this game earlier looked completely different. Normally, the maid lay dead, but everything around her was clean, as if she had died a non-violent death. But now, their room was more like a room where cattle were being butchered. The girl was in shock. She held her black blood-stained sword and didn't understand what to do or how she could keep her boy safe from seeing it. But turning around to make sure it was intact, she found that Mr. Diane had long since pulled off the veil and was watching them excitedly, and afterward inquired of the protagonist if she had been able to defeat her. The girl admitted to herself that she had killed her. In previous times, dead flowers had bloomed around the murdered maid. Corpse flowers literally meant just that. They bloomed red when the person died, but when the monsters, the Moros, the flowers were black. The maid who had turned into a morosa, the metallic smell of blood, and the scent of corpse flowers. Everything was too real and distinct this time. The girl realized that it was probably some kind of mistake, but then she remembered the promise she'd made to her ward in the previous episode, and that's when she guessed that maybe that ominous voice had transported her into the world of the game for real. The girl looked around the room in shock. She was covered in blood and didn't understand how she should proceed. The girl looked around the room in shock. She was covered in blood and didn't understand how to proceed. In the end, they decided to leave that room and get some rest. Everyone around the protagonist, the boy, the maids, and the girl herself, remained silent, not understanding what they should say in such a situation. Then one of the maids turned to Mrs. Rin and told her that they would try to clean the room as soon as possible and asked her to wait in the guest room for a while. She assured the worried maid that she was fine and not to worry so much. But after looking around at his chair, it was obvious to everyone that Diane was feeling insanely depressed and uncomfortable. Then the girl, still looking intently at the boy, turned to the maids and said she had changed her mind. They should finish as soon as possible if possible. She could see that her boy was too frightened by everything that had happened, and then she remembered that last time in situations like this she had moved on to the next episodes and everything had forgotten itself. But now, what was happening was completely different. Because of a bug in the system, she couldn't look at her character history or check the map. She also couldn't look at the item store or customize the environment, and most importantly, she couldn't log out. The girl was bewildered as she tried to answer to herself how long this bug would last. She still didn't understand why no one explained anything to her, as it usually happens in the game. So because of the protagonist's ignorance of what had happened, she and Diane sat in awkwardness and silence. In addition, the girl was very worried that because of the child saw the battle with the monster, the boy began to fear her, and this caused the protagonist incredible pain. Since she didn't understand how she could comfort him, even though she could see that he was too scared, so she did not know how she should behave or whether she should help him in any way. The protagonist awkwardly apologized to him for seeing everything that had happened. Afterwards, she asked the maid to bring a vase of holy water, as well as warm tea. In the end, her request was fulfilled. The girl brought insanely appetizing desserts for tea, as well as a vase of beautiful blue flowers. The nice maid also brought a towel and told her that Mrs. Rin should wipe her face. She thanked her for her concern, as she had completely forgotten about the monster's blood on her face. And afterwards, she realized that in principle the boy's reaction to her was not surprising. After all, the girl also saw such a frank scene for the first time. Then the girl, when she had brought her face into relative order, looked at Mr. Diane carefully and suggested that perhaps they should begin their acquaintance anew. But then she was interrupted by someone's voice. When the golden-haired boy entered the room, he was surprised by what he saw and said that he had learned that a teacher had come to room 7. The golden-haired boy entered the room, surprised at what he saw, and said that he had heard that the teacher had come to room 7. It was the angel of the second room, Manhwa, that young man who reeked of luxury. Manuel was the most popular character among the others, who appeared most often in the player's videos. He was her second favorite, so every time she lost with Diane, she had an incredible desire to change her ward to Manuel. Manuel admiringly asked the two of them if it was true that the new kindergartner had been able to kill Amoros on the first day. He looked at the monster's blood on the protagonist's face, smiled happily, and said that the rumors were true. The boy arrogantly said that perhaps the new teacher would be very useful in their mansion and asked her name. Diane, looking at this picture, was not on a joke angry, such behavior on the part of Manuel, and so angrily looking at him with all his usual seriousness, asked why he was so interested in his tutor. But the man didn't seem to understand why he was so angry over nothing, and explained that he just wanted to know her name. The protagonist, awkwardly watching them, holding a mug with aromatic tea, which she planned to enjoy alone, realized that this was an insanely strange atmosphere, and it had never happened before. Manuel continued to argue with Diane, but first, looking at him confidently, said that this girl was his first tutor, so the boy was probably worried that he might take her for himself. And then with a snide smile, said that in principle he was right to worry, because they were on different levels. And then, with the most innocent face possible, he asked if it was not obvious to the boy who his teacher would choose between the two of them. The one was full of embarrassment and just grudgingly turned away from his interlocutor, not wanting to answer. The girl, who had been watching the whole time, was madly embarrassed and flattered by the boy's reaction. She didn't understand why he was acting like that, but she assumed that maybe he liked her so much that he didn't want to part with her. But then the girl was led out of her fantasy by Manuel, who suggested that she leave Diane and move in with him as his tutor. Toth rose from his seat with anger and yelled at the cocky boy, telling him to stop saying such nonsense since Rin was his tutor. They were throwing sparks at each other. And in the middle of it all was the main character who was watching from the side. The girl obviously felt very uncomfortable because the children were fighting because of her. Then she held up her hands in an attempt to calm them down and informed them that they needed to stop fighting and get a grip. Manuel, turning to Diane, said that the teacher's words had been addressed to him, but he asked angrily if that insolent boy was just jealous of him, and afterwards he added that it was absolutely useless. Then Manuel sat down on a chair, and after looking over Diane, he thought about the fact that he had something to ask Madame Rin about. Therefore, turning to the protagonist, which not on a joke surprised her, Minuel said that he wanted to get from her the most honest answer about who was more important to the girl, Diane or Minuel, and then he began to praise himself and told me that he was known for his good relationship with the caretakers, and suggested that the protagonist must have chosen room number 7 only because there were no other options. Diane listened to all of this and was deeply saddened, but didn't dare to answer or object to anything, as this question had been asked to Miss Rin, and she must answer it herself. At this time, there were only one thoughts in the main character's head. These thoughts returned to Diane in an attempt to comfort him. As for the girl, he was the best, and she did not understand why his face was so sad. Then she, in all seriousness, answered the minnow who had dared to offend her boy about her having chosen Diane because she herself had wanted to. He looked at her with puppy dog crying eyes, not believing that the protagonist really wanted to stay with him. Then Minuel said that it could not be so, and he did not believe in her words at all. Afterwards, he asked if this boy was the girl's favorite. The girl reflected on the fact that she had wasted a lot of time while raising Diane. Even though it was very hard for her, she hadn't abandoned him. It was because of the increased difficulty of going through the game with him that he remained not as popular with other players. But if she said that to him, it would be too much. Then Minuel inquired who was in second place for the girl. The boy looked anxiously at her face and waited for an answer, and she coolly brought the cup to her lips and informed him that she also had Diane in second place and she wasn't going to change that. The one was shocked and started asking who she had in third place then. Since Diane had taken the first 2, there must be someone else in third place. The protagonist, folding her arms and resting her chin on them, looking at her interlocutor as directly and confidently as possible, said that Diane was also in third place for her. At that moment, she remembered that she had once thought of changing her character. But that thought was only for a moment. Diane had always been her number 1, but of course there were other characters she liked, but looking at the boy's worried face, she couldn't admit it to him. The girl looked confidently at Minuela and informed her that no matter how many applicants she had, she would continue to choose Diane time after time. And afterward, a little frustrated and depressed, she remarked that despite all the failures, she kept choosing him among the others, and this time too, she wouldn't trade him. Minuel was clearly angry and dissatisfied with her answer and said that the protagonist apparently has absolutely no understanding of people and that he did not need such a teacher, and then left the room, closing the door loudly behind him. Then Diane and the girl could finally find themselves in a calm and pleasant atmosphere. Diane was already less shy about asking the main character if he was really her number 1. The girl was able to hold herself back because of the influx of emotions from the boy's innocent face, and after crying, she told him that he was really a special child for her and she didn't want anyone else. The girl felt very relieved that the boy was no longer afraid of her. She smiled sweetly at him and said that she would like to introduce herself again in a normal atmosphere. With a bright smile to the child, she said that her full name was Rin Dorchester and promised to take care of the young gentleman. The boy smiled radiantly and said he wished they could get along. Then he asked why Rin was talking to him as if she were a servant, and he noticed that her manner of speech was completely inappropriate for her status. The girl awkwardly noticed that her ward was much more perceptive than she had expected, for she had indeed been playing for maids for a long time. But trying to make a face as plausible as possible, she told him that she was much more comfortable communicating this way. Diane calmed her down and told her that she didn't need to change anything and that she could behave the way she was used to, because he had nothing against it, and just wanted to ask about it. And the girl wondered what her duty as a tutor was. She had never heard of such a position before, but she realized that she could not admit it to Diane, as he was unlikely to understand such a question. After all, the protagonist, and already hard to get trust from the boy, and she did not want to let him realize that she is not competent. Therefore, the girl decided to find out about it later, so the protagonist decided to return to the discussion of the maid who had attacked him. But the boy immediately said that he realized that she was a Moros, and then awkwardly said that he was surprised to see the monster so close for the first time, so he was confused and could not react. The girl said she was certainly sure that the young gentleman was not at all frightened and was in fact a very brave and courageous boy, but Diane saw her face when she said it, so he said that he was not as weak as it might seem at first glance, and then with all determination continued that if such a situation happens again, he will definitely be able to protect himself. And a protagonist, the girl seemed clearly unprepared to hear something so sweet from her ward, so her heart sank for a second and her breath caught, but then she cried with happiness and all her thoughts became confused. The girl, instead of thinking of one thing and saying what she ought to have said according to her position, did something else. She mentally thanked the gentleman for such a sincere and genuine desire to protect her, and said that he was like a beautiful, sweet fairy. Such a comment of the girl did not go unnoticed, and the young gentleman, very embarrassed by what she had said, asked what she meant by saying that. She awkwardly clasped her hands over her mouth and realized what she had done and gathered herself and apologized, explaining that the young gentleman seemed very nice to her and she couldn't help herself, and said what she shouldn't have stayed. The boy was embarrassed as he drank his tea. When a maid came up addressing Mrs. Rin, she informed him that her room was ready for use and offered to escort her and show her everything. At that moment, Diane awkwardly rose from her seat and said that she should go to her room because he wanted to be alone. The girl wanted to stay with him a little longer, but he pushed her toward the door where the maid was waiting for her and told her that he needed to rest alone and she should go. But at that moment his whole face and even his ears were burning with embarrassment. The boy clearly could not yet accept the girl's comparison. She smiled sweetly, realizing what was going on. Afterwards she told the young gentleman that she would go to her room and he should get a good rest before their next meeting. After a while, the girl found herself in the player's room, and looking around, she was surprised to see that everything was exactly the same as last time. She noticed that there was still no response from the system. As she sat on the bed, she wondered how long this error would last. The girl knew that usually after 48 hours, the system automatically throws players out of the game. And then the protagonist thought about the fact that most likely she would have to wait all this time to leave the game. That thought really bothered her. But afterwards, she decided not to jump to conclusions because the real time and the time in the game are calculated completely differently. In reality, 48 hours equated to about half a month in the game. The girl, lying down on the bed, in her voice asked the developers to deal with the problem as soon as possible. Since on Monday she had to go to work, but the girl's memories would not let her rest, and once in a while thoughts of that mysterious voice that had told her he was entrusting Diane's care to her surfaced in her mind. Then she wondered if it was just a mistake. She realized that there was a small possibility that everything that had happened was a mistake in the system, and she didn't realize what she should do in such a situation if her fears were confirmed. But the protagonist abruptly ordered herself to get up and do some motor activity. As when she does nothing, bad thoughts come into her head. She decided to go and wash her body and finally wash the disgusting blood off her face. At that moment, under the sound of monotonously flowing water, she thought that everything in this world looked insanely true, as if the game had become reality. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she tried to reassure herself about the impossibility of such an outcome. The girl was glad that despite the error in the system, she was still with her usual face. After all, she had worked very hard to customize her appearance. She was even afraid to remember how hard it had been to adjust all the numerical values for even the smallest detail of her appearance. After she washed her face, the girl decided it was worth looking around the room, since there was nothing else to do for now. When she opened her closet, she saw a beautiful outfit with a precious brooch. The protagonist admitted to herself that it was the first time she had seen such clothes, and it was the form of a tutor. The girl carefully looked through the closet, but suddenly her attention was focused on the fact that there was no what she needed. What she was looking for right now was a suitcase that is given to quite players at the beginning of the game, and it's usually on the bed at the very beginning. It contains weapons, personal items, and an instruction book, and the girl really wanted to look into this book to see what her job as a caretaker was. The girl pondered that a caretaker probably does the same thing that parents usually do. Taking the uniform, the protagonist began to scrutinize it and noted that she had been given a special uniform for this position. If she was the only one who had one, she must be the only educator in the house. After Rin thought about the fact that in all her 43 attempts, this was the first time she had heard of such a realm, and perhaps it had only just been introduced into the game. She speculated that perhaps it was the introduction of this realm that might have caused such a bug in the system. And afterward, the protagonist began to sadly reminisce about her limited edition items that she bought with real money and that didn't end up with her now. She cursed the creators of the game and said that if she wasn't reimbursed for everything, she would riot. But she quickly calmed down, realizing that her anger would get her nowhere, and started hanging up her new clothes. She wondered if she should go outside to look for her suitcase. Maybe it had just been left out, but when she came out of her room, she found that there was absolutely no one around. The girl sincerely hoped that maybe one of the maids would know something about the bag. But the one who was responsible for preparing her room frightenedly reported that she had left the bag in her private room and excitedly wondered if it had disappeared. The protagonist confirmed her fears. Afterwards, she noticed that the girl was scared out of her mind when she was near her. The protagonist suggested that perhaps this behavior was due to the fact that she had recently killed a maid that had turned into a monster. And afterward, wandering around the mansion, she thought about the fact that the maids claimed to have last seen her bag in her room. The girl realized that the instruction book was not that important, as she would be able to understand the essence of the duties, but she needed at least some weapon. Then she stared intently at something. Then she held up a weapon that looked like an elongated axe with sharpened blades on both sides. She was thinking that it might be a good weapon to have in case of an emergency, but suddenly something distracted the girl. When she turned her attention to her feet, she saw that a small box had rolled toward her. She bent down to pick it up. When it was in her hand, she looked at it and wondered where it had come from. But suddenly the protagonist noticed a young boy standing in front of her, who informed her that he was the one who had dropped his box. It was the angel of the first room, Ruska. Before, the girl could only meet him by taking a special route, but here he appeared by himself to her great surprise. The girl wondered if it was just a mistake, but didn't let it show and sweetly handed him the box, asking him not to drop it again. But the box was roughly snatched away by an evil-looking woman who was covered in voile and dressed in all black clothes. The woman looked angrily at Rin and ordered her to stay away from her child next time. She looked at the protagonist with a clear threat. The girl awkwardly tried to remember who this woman was and to understand the reason for looking at her so fiercely, but no memories came to her mind. Then she straightened up and with awkwardness informed him that she only wanted to give him back what he had dropped, and she had no evil thoughts on her mind. The woman angrily looked down at the girl with a certain menace in her voice and said that she would decide for herself whether her child should pick up what had fallen or just throw it away. Then she dropped the box from her hands, and it spun and fell to the floor. The woman said that no one could be sure that Rin hadn't done anything with it, so she couldn't just give it to her child. The girl was obviously shocked at such an accusation from a lady unknown to her. She didn't know what she should say, but she didn't need to. The woman, turning to Ruska, told him that they must leave, and afterward they headed past her with some definite pomp. The girl awkwardly watched them and realized that additional characters had been added to the game, and admitted to herself that it was the first time she had seen this woman, and perhaps she too had been added recently. And then she realized that her character was very rude. The protagonist was happy that new interesting content had been added, and she could see the first NPC in this game. Afterward, she headed to the backyard of the mansion. She searched the area to find something that might be of use to her. In her search, she came upon a statue. She stood in front of the majestic lion, which was made of stone. She thought that the object she wanted should be close to it. She began groping the statue and afterward discovered a box of firearms. The main character happily pulled it out of the box and remembered that she was supposed to use it in the 10th episode. But she decided to change the course of the game a bit, as she was not provided with another weapon, so she had to use what she had. A child's laughter brought her out of her musings. She looked in the distance and saw two children running merrily through the clearing. They were discussing some recent event, how Cheshi had fallen into the pond. Both children were laughing at this. As the girl watched them carefully from the bushes, she realized that she didn't know what they were talking about, since it was the first time she had heard his name, and she was very curious about who the children were talking about. Still, she decided to turn around and head back to the mansion, since all she needed to do was find a weapon. But suddenly, she climbed out of the bushes and the first thing she found was a man standing in front of her who was completely wet. She was surprised to see him and clearly didn't know how to react. Due to the fact that the guy said absolutely nothing and also looked quite terrifying, the girl assumed that it was probably Moros and was glad that she had time to pick up her weapon. But unexpectedly for her, the guy smiled and afterward said hello to her, informing her that he had heard about the new kindergarten teacher from room 7 and assumed that she was the protagonist. The protagonist awkwardly discovered that she was wrong and the guy, to her great relief, was not a monster, but mentally scolded him for scaring her so much. The girl tried to pull herself together and said hello to him. As the man swept his wet hair away from his face, the girl discerned just how handsome he was. His exquisite arms, as well as his shirt that was wet due to the water and was tightly fitted to his body, all made him look incredibly handsome. The girl opened her eyes wide, looking at him, not realizing when they had time to add a new character to the game. And after looking at him, she noticed that even unexpectedly, the body of this young man is quite strong and attractive. The girl immediately assumed that this guy is probably not an ordinary worker. That's when he approached the main character and said he was insanely excited to meet her, and said he was very surprised to hear that room 7 finally had a tutor. Smiling sweetly, the man wondered why the girl was walking all alone in such a place and suggested that she must have gotten lost. She agreed with him, for she realized that she could not admit to him that she had come here to take the weapon. But the man reassured her, saying that it was to be expected, because their mansion was really huge, so it would be easy to get lost in it at first. And after turning to her in a friendly manner and smiling, he offered to give her a tour of the neighborhood. The girl gladly accepted his invitation, although she confessed that she didn't really need the excursion because she had walked up and down it 43 times, so it was like a home for her. The girl looked carefully at the man and asked him if he wanted to come in and change because his clothes were completely wet. Afterwards, she offered to give the tour at another time. A dazzlingly handsome man apologized to the protagonist for having to see him like that. Afterwards, he explained that he wanted to get the children a ball, which coincidentally had fallen into the pond, and afterward he good-naturedly explained that she shouldn't worry about him, as it was warm enough outside, so his clothes would dry quickly. The protagonist did not insist anymore, till they went on a little excursion. The man introduced himself. His name was Cheshi, and he had arrived in this place 3 years ago. The girl scrutinized his face and admitted to herself that the man was insanely attractive. But afterward, not letting such obscene thoughts interfere with her judgment, she introduced herself in return. He said with a smile that he thought her name was insanely beautiful. He also greeted her and congratulated her on her arrival at their mansion. Looking closely at the man, the girl realized that this was the first time she was seeing a non-game character, and he seemed to be new here, but the protagonist could not yet recognize what his role was. Then the man noticed that the girl was clearly behind him and good-naturedly asked if he should not be a little slower, because perhaps he was in too much of a hurry. The girl assured him it was all right and hurried after him. The man scrutinized her and asked if it was true that she had to get rid of the monster on the first day. Afterward, he added admiringly that the girl was incredibly strong. She tried to convince him that there was nothing wrong with what she had done, since there was only one monster. But the man, fascinated by the protagonist and her determination, reported that she killed him on her own without help, and it really was amazing. This game has monsters and evil spirits preying on the young gentleman of the mansion. The evil spirits are called by the Latin word demons, and moros from Latin translates to corpse, death, or doom. They are all as dangerous as their names. But it wasn't hard to get rid of the maid. After all, she was acting on intuition that had developed after 43 repetitions of the same battle, but the protagonist couldn't tell him because he wouldn't understand. The man, looking at her carefully, said that apparently the rumors about her were absolutely true, and afterwards he said that there were rumors that the girl had taken an elite course. The girl was surprised, not understanding what he meant, but still trying not to get out of character. She asked, "Is it even possible that they say that about her?" Then the man explained that everyone was interested in her when they heard that there would be a new tutor in room 7. But nothing was known about the girl, only rumors. Then Cheshi said that since she had destroyed the monster so easily, in all likelihood, the rumors of her exceptionalism weren't lying. The girl laughed off this compliment and thought to herself that because of the single mistake, she didn't know the new settings of the game, so she couldn't openly tell him that he was wrong. And afterwards, she thought deeply that also in this game, because of a mistake, some elite course appeared, and apparently the tutor is hired not by interview, as it was with the maids. Then the man pulled her out of her thoughts and told her that all the other educators were interested to know more about her. He continued that if she was really from the elite, she should know the tutor from room 4 well. And then he added that this tutor came from Stell. The girl wondered, following him, that she had absolutely never heard of such a name before, but assumed that apparently one of the group of elite caretakers had such a name. Cheshi turned to her and looked at her with attention and asked if she knew that there would be a welcome banquet in her honor tonight. She only mentally acknowledged that it was the first time she'd heard it from him, but didn't let on. Mr. Cheshi said that they could meet there next time and talk about everything normally. The girl smiled at him and told him that she was looking forward to their next meeting. But interrupting their sweet conversation, footsteps sounded, and in the room came Minuel, who called out to Cheshi and grudgingly inquired what the man was doing with the new caretaker. He looked at her with a maddeningly displeased look that made her uncomfortable. The boy was clearly unhappy that she hadn't been kicked out of the mansion yet. And the one looking at the disgruntled boy noticed his great resemblance to the perpetually angry cat. The boy angrily turned to Cheshi and said that he shouldn't spend time with the main character because he had a lot of work to do and should hurry up. The girl turned to the boy and asked him if he knew the young gentleman, but he looked at her insultingly and made no reply. Then Cheshi reassured the young lord, informing him that he was on his way to run his errands. The girl, looking at the young man's back as well as scrutinizing the Minuel, wondered why he was looking for him so much and suggested that perhaps he was one of the caretakers. The man, turning to the girl and rewarding her with an attentive studying look, informed her that he would show her the mansion a little later. The girl decided not to wait and confirm or deny her guesses already, and so she directly asked if Mr. Cheshi was an educator like her. He smiled and apologized for not introducing himself. Then he said that he was responsible for raising Minuel from the second room. He left immediately. That was the end of their conversation, and already alone, the protagonist was on her way to her room. Looking at the view from the window, she found that it was quite late and she had spent a lot of time walking. But then she remembered about Cheshi and thought about the fact that even though he was kind to her, for some reason the man seemed somehow strange to the protagonist. The girl immediately realized that she had been too careless to be excited about the new characters. Although she was obviously happy that she had no trouble getting the most important weapon. So now it was time to return to her pupil Diane. She dreamed that perhaps her pupil would be happy to see her and admitted that she had not expected him to be so nice to her. Suddenly she was brought out of her reverie by someone's call. She turned around, looking carefully for the person who was speaking to her. A maid hurriedly ran up to her and informed her that they had a huge problem with Mr. Diane. The girl was shocked by such information. She did not understand how she should behave and what she should say. She was terribly worried that the worst had happened and informed herself that the story of the moonfish had already begun. The girl excitedly ran through the mansion, panting, opened the door to his room and called out to the boy. The protagonist, crying from fright for her ward, asked the boy what had happened while she was away. But the boy, in an attempt to reassure her, said that nothing terrible had happened, and he was just a little bruised because of carelessness, and then excitedly, looking at the girl, inquired where she was going, for she had been gone a long time, and he could not find her in the room. The girl, still with tears in her eyes from fright and excitement, looking at the poor boy's injured leg, said that her suitcase was missing, so she went in search of it, and after getting excited, went on to ask how the young gentleman had managed to injure himself so easily in such a short time while she was away. The boy only embarrassedly reassured the protagonist that he didn't blame her for the disappearance and had no intention of doing so. Afterwards, he said that he had only bruised his leg and that there was not even a wound, just a small bruise. She looked carefully at his bruised leg and remembered that Diane was the sort of character who could easily get hurt, but still, it seemed to her nothing more was going to happen today. Since she'd already dealt with the Moro's maid, the girl, looking at her ward unhappily, informed him that from now on she would always stay close to him so that he could not hurt himself again. Afterwards, she approached Rose, who was standing at his bedside table, and asked him to wait for a while. The protagonist informed the boy that his leg was now wearing a terribly made bandage, so she offered to redo it. As she rewound the boy's leg, the girl remembered that there was something good about Diane hurting himself all the time in comparison. She had to update her knowledge of medicine and improve her skills. There were healer characters in the mansion, of course, but they were all charlatans, unable to even apply a bandage properly. The boy watched in amazement as the girl wrapped his leg and reported that it was the first time he had seen such a method of bandaging, and he was indeed much more comfortable with such bandages. The girl sadly realized that because of one mistake all the settings had been reset, so now her healing skills were somewhere on the first level. She would have to gain experience points by treating the maids who were injured during the walk. The girl, embarrassed and awkward, inquired, did the boy fall while walking to her room? He looked away from the girl and told her that he was looking for her because he wanted to go to the welcome banquet with her. The girl sitting beside his bed looked at her patient unhappily, informing him that she was ready to do whatever he wanted with him, but because of his bruise, he would have to rest today. He panicked and tried to explain that he was fine and they could go to the banquet. But the girl smiled and said that if he was so eager to go to the banquet, she had a way, and suggested that he ask Rumor to prepare crutches or a wheelchair for him. But he, as expected, started to be nasty and explained that he didn't want to do it. He looked down at his leg in embarrassment, letting them know that he was worried that the other gentlemen or their caretakers would find out that something was wrong with him. Then the boy would seem weak to all of them, and Diane really didn't want that. The girl, looking at her ward with embarrassment, thought her favorite fish, Luna, wanted to look stronger in front of the others, and even now he seemed insanely cute to her, despite his seriousness. Then the boy sadly suggested that the girl go to the welcome banquet alone, but the protagonist immediately reacted to his words and said that she would not go anywhere without him because she did not want to leave him alone. Then the boy explained that he felt good, so the girl could go to dinner without any second thoughts because it was a banquet in her honor. And he said that it couldn't be that the main character didn't show up because it could happen only once, but he didn't explain what he meant. The girl noticed that he spoke about it with a maddeningly desperate voice. Though he tried to look otherwise, the main character partially understood his feelings. She was also curious about the welcome banquet, but she had already gone through the game 44 times, so even if she missed it now, she could attend it without much trouble later. But for Dayan, it was completely different. Besides, he was the only one in this game who hadn't had a tutor in a long time. And this banquet must have been a truly special occasion. The girl wondered what was coming out of this situation. There was no way out. The boy interrupted her musings and said he was willing to wait for her, but wanting to ask one favor when the protagonist returned from the banquet. But the girl looked at the boy with sincere affection for him and embarrassedly informed him that she would give him a hug, and afterward they would go to the banquet together. The boy was madly surprised and embarrassed at such a suggestion from the girl and wondered what she meant. But she was full of enthusiasm and explained that he himself had said earlier that he didn't want others to know he was hurt. So she had one good idea. She offered to tell the others that the main character was so excited to be his caretaker, so she decided to go to the banquet with him, putting him in a carrier. The boy was shocked at such a suggestion from the protagonist and wondered what she meant by carrying it, but the girl had already gone in search of it, praising herself for the wonderful idea. But the boy, stopping her, informed her that he would never agree to that. Such words made the protagonist cry, informing her that he was being very heartless by denying her such a small and insignificant request. Afterwards, with the sweetest face, she asked him to think about the idea again and promised to take care of him. Initially, the girl thought it was a good idea, but the boy still resisted, repeating that no way he would not do it. Eventually, some time passed, and she put on her special uniform and was already heading down the wide and beautifully trimmed hallways to the banquet. She realized that she could have carried him to the dining room without a problem, and she was genuinely sorry that he didn't agree. But the girl realized that he was probably even more upset than she was. She remembered how the man had convinced her that he could stay alone and she should go, since a banquet like this only happened once. The girl admitted that she would be much happier if they went together, but she couldn't help it because Diane said he didn't want to appear weak in front of others. So she promised she'd have fun here for her ward, and then she'd come back. She knew that all the caregivers would gather here, so she decided to gather as much information as possible. When she entered the room, she found a lot of people sitting around with their charges. She realized at once that most likely everyone was already gathered and waiting for her to arrive. As she greeted them, she noticed a look of bewilderment on their faces, and then she realized that most likely everyone here were new characters. Then Cheshi said a nice hello to her and informed her that he was happy to see her at this banquet. It seems he really was the only one favoring her as a caretaker. Unlike Sesha-san, the Roski teacher looked at her with distrust, her gaze clearly showing some disdain. And afterward, she turned her attention to another boy sitting across from the man who was most likely his tutor. The girl, seeing such a tense atmosphere, thought that this was not at all like a welcome banquet, for she was greeted with some skepticism and was not at all happy about her arrival. But then a friendly boy spoke to her, who inquired, "Is she really that famous kindergarten teacher from room 7? But this boy's teacher asked him to behave more culturally, and with a sigh he said he couldn't even say hello normally anymore. The girl smiled and announced that her name was Rin, and she was the teacher Diane from room 7. The main character was genuinely glad that the boy had spoken to her first, as he had made her task very easy. Then the girl awkwardly sat down in her seat and wondered if she could probably take it since it was the only one available. A green-haired lady sat across from her and asked with a haughty look, did the girl intend to attract attention at first sight, and then she asked, why did she dare to come to them dressed like that? The girl looked over her outfit and reported that it was in her closet when she arrived and didn't understand what the problem was. The protagonist eyed the woman carefully, while she herself thought about the fact that she thought her outfit seemed quite appropriate for such a situation. Then another man sitting across from him said that the protagonist had dealt with the monster from the beginning, and now she was dressed like that, so she clearly had the intention to stand out. The girl thought uneasily that even if she did make a mistake with her outfit, there was no need for him to be so rude to her, and she didn't understand at all why everyone in this place was so negative towards her. But still, gathering all her restraint in her hands, she inquired, could they introduce themselves first, since they were all meeting for the first time. Then the green-haired woman rewarded her with a displeased look and continued to examine the heroine. Then the girl awkwardly explained that it seemed that everyone gathered here already knew and had heard about her to a greater or lesser extent, but she knew absolutely no one among them, except for Mr. Cheshi, who she had coincidentally met earlier. He smiled at the fact that she had singled him out among the others. The woman looked at her angrily and said that apparently the girl had not paid any attention to them while she was studying at the elite. Hearing such an angry comment from the educator, the protagonist immediately realized that everyone was acting a little strange, because today was her first day of work as an educator in this mansion, and it was quite obvious that she didn't know any of them. Then Mr. Cheshi turned to the audience and said that the rules in Stella might be different from the rules in other places. Then Mr. Cheshi turned to the protagonist and said with a smile that since she came from another place, it was understandable why she was different from them and might not have seen the information from the head of the house. But at the end he added that it was only his guest and asked the protagonist to confirm or deny his guesses. The girl agreed with Mr. Cheshi and then thought that apparently he was talking about a system that transmits information about other educators to new educators. The protagonist could understand the resentment of the others in such a case, but The girl had no intention of apologizing or making excuses for her ignorance. After all, regardless of the reason, whether it was a sense of inferiority or superiority, now all these educators sit together with their pupils and allow the children to show such inappropriate behavior. The protagonist was embarrassed to think that this was completely out of line with their qualifications. But she was brought out of her musings by Mr. Cheshi, who turned to Mr. Raven and asked, hadn't he met Ms. Rin before? And then he said that Miss Rin didn't seem to recognize him at all. Then Cheshi turned to the gentleman and reminded him that when they had chatted in private earlier, the latter had informed him that he had never heard her name in Stella. Such a remark caused the man's mouth to spill out of the wine, which he had hitherto been drinking with full nobility. The girl immediately remembered that the Chishi had told her that there was only one Stell tutor here. The girl immediately remembered that the Chishi told her that there was only one tutor from Stella. Therefore, the protagonist reasonably wondered, who was this man? The girl then, turning to Chisha, inquired, was this really the gentleman he had been talking about during their walk together? Then the girl realized that most likely, if a player chooses to play the role of an educator, he is, by default, either a native of Stella or not, but still decided not to jump to conclusions and observe to fully understand everything. Then the girl turned to the fair-haired gentleman and inquired, had he not heard her name before? He laughed and awkwardly said that perhaps he had only heard it in passing, for Stella, albeit one of a kind, had many departments. Then the other kindergarten teacher sensibly remarked that they should all introduce themselves anyway. The blonde-haired man awkwardly agreed with her opinion and invited everyone to speak in turn. The girl, looking around at all the educators, caught herself thinking that they looked as if they were up to something, and then decided to arrange everything that she had managed to understand and hear during this time. The protagonist has compiled the following profiles of the people who work here. The first room, the object of the game is Ruska, a calm and cold young man. The teacher Marianne is an unfriendly witch, a sharp girl who looks like a northerner. Room 2, the object of the game is Minuel, a narcissistic young man with a harsh temper and a desire to do things only the way he wants. Cheshi's tutor, a man with a pleasant personality and beautiful violet eyes, seems a bit naive. Room 3, the object of the game is Vivi, a friendly young man who seemed nice and mild enough to the protagonist. Educator Eugenia gives the impression of a smart girl. She seems insanely committed to the rules. In the fourth room, the object of the game was Leo, a young man who loves to banter. He is very bright and active. Educator Raven is an intelligent man, but the protagonist wasn't sure if he was really an elite from the Stella. In the fifth room, the object of the game was Sergio, a calm and docile young man with a quiet temperament. His tutor Olivia is a feisty witch. The protagonist seemed to hate the elite. In room 6, the object of the game was Jay, a smart young man who seemed too unemotional to the protagonist. His tutor was Gilbert, and he seemed to the protagonist to be a silly, silent man who didn't say a word. And finally, the 7th room, the object of Diane's play, the sweetest, most handsome and charming young man, with eyes as red as rubies and white hair flitting in the wind. His tutor, Rin, the protagonist, is a Diane servant who has worked tirelessly on her appearance. The rest of the explanation she chose to leave out. The girl wondered if she had missed anything. Analyzing all the people gathered, and afterwards she decided that first she should put everything in her head, but before that she would have to learn them all, because in the future they would see each other very often. But afterward, the protagonist sensibly remarked that perhaps the bug in the game would be fixed, and she wouldn't have to meet these unpleasant with a few exceptions anymore. Then suddenly, from behind her back, a maid came up to her and told her that the food was ready to be served. The girl turned around and noticed that a maid had approached each of the caretakers and placed an iron tray with a large lid on it. The girls informed everyone that steak and chimichurri sauce was on their menu today, a special dish in honor of the welcome party. So the maids hoped everyone could enjoy it. But when the maid lifted the lid of the protagonist's dish, all those gathered were horrified to see what was on the dish. One of the servants could not even resist and eventually fell down. The girls were shaking, not understanding why something like that was on the dish. Cheshi-san watched the contents of the plate with his eyes wide open in horror, not knowing how to comment on it. Then the girl noticed that there was a corpse flower in her plate, a red flower that only blooms when a person dies. But the girl immediately realized that the flower on her plate was not a corpse flower at all, and it seemed to be just similar in shape and colored red. She didn't know whose handiwork it was, but she thought such an act was an insanely bad joke. The main character laughed and said that the Redford mansion had a rather interesting way of welcoming guests, and after angrily piercing the flower with a fork, then all those gathered watched in horror as the protagonist ate part of it without fear or doubt. The whole audience did not understand why she was doing it and what was going on, but the girl only asked emotionlessly, Don't ordinary educators eat such things? And after wiping her mouth, she said that they had tried very hard to prepare such a surprise for her, to enjoy some kind of her reaction, either fear or excitement. She didn't know. The girl poured water into her plate, and it immediately turned red in color. Then the girl continued that she did not know yet who had prepared such a gift for her, but she thanked for such an unexpected surprise and then rose from her seat and announced that the people gathered must have been expecting her reaction and were quite upset since she had ignored it so easily. Then, for the first time ever, the girl said with a truly wicked smile that whoever had thought it up should wait in fear for her return surprise. And then she thought that it seemed that the game for the 44th time would be much more interesting than it had been before. The girl, after all that had happened, joyfully made her way to young Master Diane's room. When she entered, she saw that the boy was very anxious to see her and asked, "Why did she come so early?" He assumed that the banquet was already over. She said, with enthusiasm, that she'd been worried that the young man might be sad alone. She thought she might have come back too soon, but at least she'd had a good time with Diane, and the atmosphere was much nicer than at the table. The boy was embarrassed to report that he wasn't sad at all and was well enough on his own. Then the protagonist excitedly inquired, did he really feel good without her? And afterwards she said that without the young gentleman she was insanely lonely at that banquet and missed him a lot. Then the girl decided to ask if the boy had managed to eat dinner while she was away, but she saw his awkward face. Then she noticed that he was looking at a tray on the table. The girl looked at it in disbelief and reached out her hand to check the contents. The protagonist worried that perhaps those who had mocked her had also decided to play a joke on Diane's food. But when she took the lid off, she saw a delicious steak underneath, and then she was relieved to see that everything was all right. The girl, trying to pretend that all was well, asked if the young gentleman wanted to dine with her. Then the boy asked excitedly, didn't she eat at the banquet? The girl tried to think of an excuse, so she informed him that she had come back early to eat with him. The boy only embarrassedly said that in that case, since she was asking for it so much, he would gladly eat, even though he hadn't been particularly hungry before. But suddenly, refuting his words, there was a stomach rumbling, to which the boy was very embarrassed, and after all flushed, tried to prove that this sound did not come from him. The girl smiled and said that she knew. That sound was from the cutie Dane, but the one with even greater displacement asked not to be called such strange names from now on. The girl showed him a plate with a beautiful chocolate cake decorated with pink icing, and afterward asked if she had brought what he had asked her for before. Diane reported that the one had made the right point and even brought him 2 pieces as he had previously requested. The girl held out a plate, informed him that he could eat them both if he wanted, but he was embarrassed to say that he hadn't originally intended to do that. And then he reached out his hands to one of the plates and turned it around, putting it in the right direction. Then the girl saw that the 2 halves of the cake formed a whole heart-shaped cake. From this sight of a seemingly ordinary cake, the heart of the protagonist trembled with great force. After all, the boy was insanely cute. Then the protagonist thought that the chef here must have a great sense of beauty. Pulling back from another heart attack caused by Mr. Diane's behavior, the girl wondered, did the boy really want to go to the banquet with her just for that cake? But he reported that he had always been very curious about what would happen if you combined the 2 pieces, and afterwards he said that he thought he looked pretty good. The protagonist hugged him tightly and informed him that she was of the same opinion, and cheerfully said that his caretaker was feeling insanely happy right now. The boy cried from such sincere words, for it was the first time he had heard something like that from her. Afterwards, he hugged her and confessed that he also felt extremely happy at that moment. The main character caught herself thinking that it seems that among the first meetings with Diane in the last 44 episodes, this one will forever remain the most significant for her. The next morning came, and the maids began to wake up slowly to go out and take their shifts. But before that, they all gathered in the temple where the Holy Father gave a sermon and suggested that they all pray first thing in the morning. Every workday is the same for the hired laborers at Redford Mansion. Before breakfast, they all gather together in the church and pray. After that, their foreheads are smeared with holy water prepared on the silver tray to purify their bodies and to determine who is human and who is morose. After the morning routine, the maids gathered and conspiratorially began to discuss what had happened, namely that the new tutor from room 7 had killed the head maid who had become morose. They worriedly whispered that no one had known she was a monster before her transformation. Then the girls began to wonder what was the point of using holy water and prayer if it didn't work in the end. One of the maids heard them and noticed that the mansion was strangely noisy today. After all, the other maids were talking nonstop, wondering if anyone had seen the new maid. Some said that the protagonist didn't look like a person of the elite at all. Many of the maids had become very uneasy since she had killed the monster on the first day. One of the maids asked her friends if the young master in room 7 would be able to go out now that he had a tutor. But suddenly, watching the other maids, she was distracted. Betty came up to her and greeted her cheerfully and asked, "Is Sarah in charge of room 7?" And then she introduced herself and said that she herself worked in the kitchen, so she had never met the new teacher, and therefore she was very curious to know what Sarah Rose thought of her and whether she was capricious. The maid confusedly remarked that she hadn't realized yet, since it had only been 3 days since her arrival. Then Betty asked if her teacher had asked her to do anything strange or questionable. But Sarah embarrassedly informed that Mrs. Rin was only borrowing clothes since she had lost her bag. Betty, smiling, realized that the girl seemed to know absolutely nothing interesting. And so Sarah Rose was not interesting to her, so wishing her a pleasant appetite she left. Sarah Rose was still watching her flee the kitchen with the rest of the maids. She knew at once that she was being used with the intention of eliciting some information, and that was to be expected. Afterwards, Sarah Rose began to think about what she should do for the day. She decided, first of all, to prepare water for washing. Some time passed and she was about to go, but suddenly she was called and the water jug was roughly yanked out of her hands. One of the maids said that her mistress was waiting, so she would borrow her water. Sarah Rose was very displeased with this behavior and informed her that she had drawn this water especially for her mistress, who was also expecting it. But the latter only remarked that she had only been about to borrow her water, and Sarah was already threatening to take it back from her. And then she asked if she thought her behavior was rude and ignorant to her colleague, and also decided to ask if such a reaction was not caused by such a strong tension because of the new 7th room, and then sarcastically asked her if she thought their rooms were on the same level. Sarah felt depressed about this attitude on the part of the other maids. She thought about the fact that it had been a week since she had worked at the mansion, and there was actually an unspoken division between all the workers. Those who worked for the caretaker and the young gentleman who had a better chance of getting out, they looked down on the others, and even tie a bow in their hand to symbolize their master and oppressed others. In this case, Sarah was at a disadvantage. After all, when she first arrived at the mansion, there was only one seat available in room 7. The girl went to her mistress and, approaching the door, informed her that she had brought water for washing. After waiting for a while and getting no response, the girl decided to open the doors, apologizing in advance for the sudden intrusion, but suddenly a tablecloth flew at her. She was very surprised and did not know what to do as she started to lose her balance and fell. But suddenly a strong arm caught her by the waist. It was the hand of the protagonist who managed to pick up the jug and the falling girl. Afterwards, she asked if she was hurt and how she was feeling. Sarah Rose awkwardly thanked her for saving her. Afterward, she looked at the protagonist carefully. She had eyes of an amazing pink color, a soft and insanely pleasant round face. Sarah Rose thought that the teacher of the 7th room, Mrs. Rin, was really a beautiful girl. At this time, the protagonist asked Sarah Rose if she had been frightened. Afterwards, she said that she had opened the window in her room too wide, and the tablecloth had flown off at the slightest draught. The girl awkwardly informed her that everything was fine, and she had come to fetch water for washing. The protagonist thanked her for doing her such an honor. Sarah Rose was still watching the protagonist wash her face. She thought that the teacher from room 7 looked young and fragile. She was worried about whether she would be able to handle her job as a teacher, noticing that she was getting more and more controversy and suspicion every day. She was brought out of her musings by Madame Rin's voice, who interrogated Sarah Rose if she had something on her face. But she said excitedly that there was nothing wrong with her face and that she looked good. Sarah Rose realized that unlike the other maids and caretakers, she did not feel any negative attitude towards the main character. Even on the contrary, she was pleasantly embarrassed by such increased attention from this beautiful girl. At this time, the protagonist pondered that the 4th day in the game Monster Mansion hosts had already arrived. The girl knew that today, because of the lazy developers, she was facing morning in the game again. Plus, the system window was still down, so she didn't know that Sarah Rose was coming. She, remembering past episodes of the game, already knew that usually the system window would immediately tell her who was approaching, as well as what her schedule was for the day. The quest window also used to appear before. As soon as she saw Sarah Rose, the protagonist began to ponder the quest by type. To try to increase the favor of the workers of the Redford Mansion is the object of the maid of the caretaker of room 7, Sarah Rosa. If you become close enough for her to share her secrets, the maid will reveal a hidden quest to the player. The girl grudgingly reported that such a quest would have been perfect here, but because of this mistake, everything was ruined. The only thing the girl was happy about so far was that nothing serious had happened. The girl washed her face. Afterwards, she realized that it was one of the things on her schedule, all because of the special rules of the Redford Mansion. Rule number 1 is to wash your face with holy water every day because there are evil spirits and monsters in the mansion. Rule number 2, if you find a gold button stained with blood on the floor, Don't pick it up, just step on it with your right foot and move on. Rule number 3. Don't ask or answer a girl dressed in all black in a hallway with purple rooms. Rule 4 is to close all windows before going to bed. Even if someone knocks on them at night, don't open them because this is only done to add to the game's atmosphere. But if you don't follow these rules, the power will decrease and the player will become more vulnerable to evil spirits. Therefore, you need to be careful. The girl remembered that the notebook in which she had written down all these rules had been left in her bag. Her notebook had evaporated with the bag, but since the girl has gone through the game 44 times already, she has had time to learn everything she needs to know, and so far she hasn't had any problems. The protagonist then turned to Sarah Rosa and thanked her for the clothes and said she would try to get them washed and returned this week. She confusedly said that Ren didn't have to do that, and if there was anything else she could do to help her, the protagonist could safely turn to her. The girl immediately noticed that there was a clear distance between them, but they had once been colleagues. In the past, they were newcomers who came to the mansion and became colleagues and roommates. Therefore, they were able to get close to each other, but this time she would have to build a relationship with her anew, and the protagonist doubted that this time she would succeed because of the difference in status. Then she awkwardly turned to the maid and asked if her overalls had any special purpose. Sarah Rose then explained that such clothes are only worn at the educator's evaluation ceremony and on the day they are expelled due to their inability to fulfill their duties. The girl realized that in such a case the reaction of the other teachers was understandable, as well as the concern about her clothes, but she admitted that it was the first time she had heard about the ceremony. The protagonist wondered if perhaps they would be divided into classes again.